passed at regular intervals. Despite being in the summer, the night air had a slight chill, signaling the inevitable coming of fall. Derek and Melissa were on their way to meet their friends at a resort on the outskirts of a national park. The friend group had originated in college and would take annual trips to fun random locations. Melissa checked her phone one last time before she was out of reach of cell service. She had received a text from her mother, but left it on read. She put the phone away and gazed out the window into the endless night sky. Derek took a sip from his energy drink and remained silent. His Google Maps instructed him to take the main turnoff off the highway. "How far out are we?" Melissa asked quietly. "We'll be there in 20 minutes, Derek responded with a frank response. The clock on the Honda center console read 1:34 a.m. The road from the highway began to slightly rattle the car, as the roads that they were now on were worn and unmaintained. The empty fields of grass and weeds lined both sides of the road, showing no signs of life aside from the occasional road sign stating the speed limit. The directions eventually led them to a turnoff onto a dirt road with an old wooden sign stating the resort's name. "We're here," Derek said quietly as he gently shook Melissa's leg. The group had already checked in for Derek and Melissa. All they needed to do was find the cabin that they were staying in and unpack. Derek drove by the clubhouse and continued his way to the isolated cabin on the far end of the resort. The resort had cabins lined on both sides of the gravel road, but hardly no cars parked out front, indicating that the resort was less busy than usual. Derek took the 5-minute drive to get to the cabin and saw multiple vehicles parked out front, but the lights inside were off. It would appear that everyone had already gone to bed. The two exited their car and began to unpack. The outside chilled air nipped at their faces as they took their bags out of their trunk and made their way to the front of the cabin. The cabin porch groaned as the two stepped onto the wooden planks of the deck. Derek tried opening the door, but the old rusty handle wouldn't turn. Derek pulled out his cell phone to call one of his friends to open the door, but luck was not on his side. His cell phone had no signal, thus he was forced to knock on the door. Melissa was annoyed and embarrassed, as Derek began to knock harder and harder to wake the inhabitants of the cabin. Shortly after, one of the friends approached the door in his underwear, with a confused look on his face. Almost immediately, he opened the door and apologized for locking them out. The two gave off a fake smile, hiding their annoyance, and proceeded into the dimly lit cabin. "Why did you guys lock the door? You knew we were coming," Derek asked, genuinely confused. Ethan, the friend in the underwear, shook his head. "I'm sorry, bro. We must have forgot to unlock it." Derek and Melissa talked with Ethan about the plans for the next day, before shuffling over to their rooms and unpacking briefly before falling asleep quickly. They were awoken the next morning to laughter and the smell of bacon cooking from the kitchen. Initially, they were both annoyed, but they got out of bed and got dressed for the day before exiting their rooms and making their way to the kitchen. In the kitchen were 3 couples: the Johnsons, the Hendersons, and the Malloys. All were couples that knew each other for years and had gotten along well for the most part. Mallory Johnson stood up to meet her friend Melissa while still chewing her breakfast and squealed. "Sorry about last night, girl," Mallory said while hugging the couple. "We forgot to unlock the door after we told some scary stories around the campfire," she said while laughing. "Today we have tons of things planned. The guys are going to play paintball at 11 and the girls are going to go horseback riding. After that, we're going to meet up for lunch at the resort's cafeteria." Melissa gave off an annoyed smile, as she didn't want to ride horses but was being polite. Derek went over and grabbed a plate and started dishing up breakfast that had already been prepared. The group was excited to have everyone there. All previous issues, whether personal or shared, seemed to have faded, and all that mattered was that they were together. The group shared memories and enjoyed breakfast with laughter and smiles. As time quickly passed, they then got ready for their activities, and then went their separate ways. The girls began their hike down to the resort, and the guys followed but eventually pulled away to go to the paintball course. The girls continued their walk to the stables located on the resort's property, An older man was seen getting the horses prepped and ready for the day. "Good morning, ladies," said the man without looking away from the horse that he was fastening a saddle to. "I think it's gonna only be us 5 today. I can take you further on the trail." The girl's eyes widened as the idea of getting more out of an already awesome experience was amazing. They jumped up and down out of excitement, and the old rancher smiled as he finished up with the horses. "All right, who has ridden a horse before?" Derek and the guys made their way over to the resort building that housed all the sporting equipment, and they all signed the safety waivers. Derek used to play paintball in high school, but hasn't played since. The other guys had played maybe once or twice, but still needed a refresher on the rules and the field etiquette. Originally, they only signed up for 2 hours, which should have been plenty of time. The girls' horseback tour was also 2 hours, so they should have lined up perfectly. Time passed and the guys played for the 2 hours. After the time expired, they returned their equipment and limped their bruise-covered legs back to the cabin to get ready for lunch. The guys took their time getting ready and used both showers in the cabin and waited on the girls to return from their ride. Once the guys were ready, they noticed that none of the girls were back from their ride. They checked the time and still hadn't returned after an hour had passed, when their ride should have been over. Derek checked his phone to see if he missed a call from Melissa, but his phone didn't have service. But seeing how this was a resort and a professional was with them, guiding them through the forest, he didn't worry. It was even likely that they had returned and decided to go to another excursion or something. The guys decided that waiting on the girls to get back from their ride was taking too long, so they decided to go ahead and get lunch without them. The guys made their way down to the cafeteria while still talking about the paintball game when they noticed a scream off in the distance. The laughter and banter stopped immediately. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, but the guys looked in the direction of the forest in which the scream came from and froze. "What was that?" said one of the guys. One of the guys started talking, listing off a number of animals it could have been when they heard another scream, but this time saying, "Help us!" All the guys remained silent as the cry for help slowly faded into the woods. The guys then all shared a concerned glance at one another and went down to the stables to see what was going on with the girls' ride, fearing that they had not yet returned. They got down to the stables and found a younger woman attending to one of the spare horses, but no sign of anyone that went on the ride earlier. "Excuse me, miss, but our wives went on a ride at 11, and they still haven't returned. Is everything okay?" The young girl turned to the men and shared an equally concerned look. "Yeah, I know. Greg should have been back a while ago. I've already called the resort to send someone out to check on them." Derek and the guy's concern began to grow more. "Is there anything we can do? Can we go out there and try to find them?" one of the guys asked. "I mean, you can. The trail is straightforward and well marked, but you have to do it on foot." Derek checked the time and looked at the trail. The guys all quickly discussed the issue and decided to let the resort find them. There was no way that they'd be able to make up the ground on foot before nightfall. The guys then went to lunch with worried minds that made eating just a distraction from what they were going through right now. They quickly finished their meals and went back to the stables to check up on the situation. This time the police were there, and an ambulance. Laying on the stretcher was Greg, the tour guide, unconscious and covered in scratches. All the guys rushed over to the place to see what was going on. The stable girl was there and filled them in on the situation. Evidently, Greg was dragged back by one of the horses while unconscious, so they didn't know what was going on. The police didn't have anything to add, and stated that they were going to send in a canine unit once it arrived, to see what they could find. One of the guys then decided that he wanted to go out on the trail, and try to find them himself. But the police said that the trail was blocked off until they knew what had happened for sure. For whatever reason, Derek's phone received a notification from Melissa that just went through. The text said, "Don't trust anyone." What? Derek showed the guys and the police the text, and they were all equally confused by what it meant. Derek tried calling Melissa, but she didn't answer. Not sure on what to do, the guys went back to the cabin and waited for nightfall. Once the police would leave, the guys would come back to the trail and search for their wives themselves. Night came and they did just that. The moon provided little light though, through the trees, but the guys had brought flashlights that did very little in terms of lighting the path. There were no signs of the girls nor the police that were supposed to be looking for them. The trail was well cleared, but the nighttime made it difficult to stay on it if you weren't paying attention. The cool air made their eyes sting as they all looked around for any signs of the missing girls. An hour into the hike and there were still no signs of anyone. The woods, accompanied with the dark night, seemed to cover any possible tracks. However, a glint of obscured light could be seen in the distance, which gave the guys hope. The men rushed over to the light, which was on the ground, and quickly saw that a policeman and his dog laid in the pool of its own blood, off the trail. Both of their organs were strewn about, but mainly undisturbed. What does this mean? What kills a policeman and its dog and not eat it? Surely not an animal, Ethan whispered out of fear. The men realized that they needed to find their wives and fast. One of the men picked up the policeman's pistol and inspected it, revealing that it was out of ammo. Great, it's empty. The men pushed on unarmed in hopes to rescue their wives. Something out here has the ability to kill a trained policeman and a German shepherd, but the guys hoped that whatever was out here had already left. The guys went back to the trail and continued deeper into the woods, when a hunched figure could be seen on the trail. It was Mallory. She was hunched over one of the horses that lay lifeless off the trail. "Hey, Mallory!" the guys shouted in unison as they rushed over to her aid. Mallory shot up and turned, revealing a bloodied and twisted face and white marbled eyes. Her limbs hung broken and twisted, as if she had fallen from a great distance. The sight of her was enough to stop the men, including her husband, from approaching her. "What happened to you? Where are the other girls?" Mallory looked on in confusion as if she didn't understand what they were saying. Mallory's mouth opened to gape and began to groan. Terror struck all the men, as they had never experienced anything like this. "I think she has a concussion," her husband whispered as he inched her way towards her. "You're hurt. We're gonna get you back to get some help. You should come with us." Mallory's looks didn't change as her husband slowly began to hug her. The men looked on in horror as what was impersonating Mallory then grew these long, horrible teeth and sunk them into her husband's neck. Everyone, including the husband, screamed out of terror. Blood gushed a rich red from his neck as Mallory took a solid chunk from his neck and began to chew. The men did their best to arm themselves and to attack Mallory. Despite her appearance, her limbs had incredible strength as she withstood most of their counterattacks from the guys. Somehow, one of the guys threw a sizable rock, hitting the creature at the base of the head, causing the creature to fall. Instead of red blood coming from the wound, a thick black liquid seemed to ooze out, while the creature slowly transformed into this unknown hairless creature. The creature's eyes were big, but it lacked facial features. It almost looked alien in nature. The men stomped out what little life the creature had, then went to check up on Mallory's husband. He was still alive, but not for long. The color in his face had drained and his hands had no longer applied pressure to the wound. His neck still spewed blood and small chunks of flesh. The remaining men looked at one another, as this was a sure sign that they needed to leave. Surely, whatever had turned into Mallory was the source of what caused the girls to go missing in the first place. "What if there's another creature out here?" one of the guys asked. "But what if this was the only one, and the girls were still hiding?" asked another. Derek and Jesse decided to continue forward, while the rest of the guys went back to notify the police. The trail continued through the woods at a slight decline. The trees were no longer as thick, but the trail eventually led to the side of a sizable cliff. Off the cliff, down a couple 100 feet, was a clearing with high weeds and a small stream. Next to the stream, not too far away, was a small light that stood out on the field and made it very easy to be seen up on the cliff's edge. The two guys didn't think twice and began their slow descent down into the trail through the clearing. After carefully descending, the two realized that the light source a good distance away was an old-looking cabin, with a single light coming from inside. Jesse and Derek looked at each other and knew that they needed to go inside. The exterior of the cabin was well worn. The cabin was probably built in the 1800s and was not kept up with since. The two approached the cabin slowly, keeping their eyes open for any more of those things. They knocked on the cabin just out of the off chance that some random person was living out here by themselves, and they could offer any help. Shuffling could be heard coming from upstairs, but no one answered the door. The two looked at each other as if they knew they had to go into the cabin for answers. They knocked on the door again, and this time no shuffling could be heard upstairs. Jesse opened the door slowly with a loud creaking sound. They both entered the cabin slowly and announced themselves. "Hello? Is anyone home?" Sounds could be heard from beneath the floor, which surprised the men, as they realized that this cabin must have had a basement. The two searched frantically for a door that led downstairs, and sure enough, they found an old wooden door with multiple locks on the exterior. Instead of looking for a key or for a tool to remove the locks, Derek began kicking the door in. The old wooden door slowly began to deform under the pressure before finally caving in. The two walked into the dark stairwell and went down the stairs. Muffled cries could be heard as the stairs creaked under their feet. The two men shined their lights to see the remaining girls chained up and gagged against the wall, while three of the creatures continued eating what remained of Greg, the writing instructor. Jesse and Derek quickly grabbed whatever item they could in the basement and began striking the creatures' skulls in, causing them to flail and spasm on the floor. Eventually, the two were able to kill the three creatures and attend to the girls chained to the wall. Derek removed Melissa's gag and asked what had happened. "We need to leave. These creatures are only the children. The bigger ones will be back." Jesse searched for the key, but to no avail. Derek grabbed whatever tool he could find and started to break the chains. The remaining girls and the two guys quickly ascended the stairs and made their way out of the cabin. As Jesse was leaving, a large Fleshgait fell from the ceiling and landed on him, knocking the wind out of him. Derek tried to go back inside to fight off the creature, but Melissa pulled him back, saying that he was already dead now, and that there was no point in trying to help him. Derek and the girls did their best to find the path back and climbed the trail back through the forest to the resort. Screams erupted from the cabin as more of the creatures returned and feasted on what remained of Jesse. The screams followed the small group at a distance through the woods as they hurried on the trail. They knew that if they stopped, they were as good as dead. The girls, being hungry and tired, slowly began to fall behind. Derek tried his best to keep them all together, but it got to the point that either some had to fall behind or they were all going to die. Derek made sure that Melissa didn't fall behind and kept her at pace with him. The Fleshgaits got closer and he could hear them pounce on one of the girls that was too slow. Thankfully, this was enough to give them time to run away, as the poor girl tried to fight helplessly for her life. Eventually, they made it to the edge of the forest, and they could see police lights at the head of the trail. This gave them the last boost they needed to get out of the woods and into safety. Standing by the police cruisers were the police and the rest of the resort. Derek and Melissa fell down out of exhaustion. The figures surrounded Derek and Melissa, and it took them a while to realize that the figures weren't the people that they thought they were. They all shared the same features that the creature that was impersonating Mallory out in the woods. Their figures were slim. Their limbs were twisted and bent at strange angles. Their mouths were wide with long, sharp teeth, and their eyes were milky white. Even if Derek and Melissa had the energy to fight them off, it would be pointless. There were too many of them, and they were too strong. The creatures quickly descended upon Derek and Melissa, tearing and feasting upon their bodies while they're still alive. They screamed helplessly out into the night, knowing that there was no one out there to save them. We never spoken about this particular event, not even amongst ourselves after it happened. It was my friends, Ben and Ryan, and me going camping out into the woods, like we used to do when we got a weekend off, or at least we used to, before this. In general, we try to go to new places. There was this one forest in particular, situated 2 hours away from our city, that we'd been told about. We'd been putting it off for a while because it was said to be dangerous, packed with wild animals that would attack campers often. Ben, in his usual part of trying to be a tough guy, said that he'd take his shotgun and that we'd be safe. Ryan was a bit of a wimp, but he agreed, so we drove there as soon as we had a free weekend. We got there mid-afternoon. After we set up camp and the night was beginning to set in, we decided to go for a walk. We secured our stuff, Ben took his shotgun in case any animals approached us, and we started following a small path that got deeper into the woods. Walks in the dark like this would always relax me, but this time I was starting to feel uneasy. Something was off. About half an hour of walking, we started to hear noises getting closer to us. They sounded like footsteps of several big creatures closing in on us, but to this day I could swear I could also hear soft whispers beneath those noises. Feeling like cornered animals in total panic, we began running back through the path that we'd come from. During this, I somehow lost Ben and Ryan, and could not even see their flashlights in the distance. I kept on running, scared crapless. At some point, I ran past an old house, which seemed to have suffered a fire. The windows were boarded up, but the doors themselves seemed half open. Suddenly, I heard something coming from inside. Terrified at first, I froze, but then I realized it was actually Ryan, calling for me to come inside. I was doubtful at first, for some reason, but as soon as I heard the animal sounds coming closer to me, I bolted into the house and closed the door. I lifted my flashlight to look around, and there was Ryan. I pointed the light in his eyes, but he didn't seem to react much. In fact, he seemed really calm, which was odd for him. "Let's stay here for now," he said in a relaxed tone of voice. "Those things are out there and they could be dangerous." Now I was worried about Ben, but remembered that worst case scenario he had a shotgun ready if anything attacked him. I took a deep breath and started looking around the room. A few chairs were laying on the floor and they looked charred. In one corner of the room there was a pile of sticks with a bunch of stones scattered around them. All of a sudden, we heard Ben's gun go off twice. I stood there, paralyzed, as every other sound in the forest stopped. I glanced briefly at Ryan and he was just looking at me, completely quiet. I was about to say something when something started banging on the door. Ryan immediately grabbed my shoulder and said, "Don't open the door. It could be one of those things." I started walking towards the door and he insisted, "Don't do it. They're going to kill us." This really unsettled me, but I was afraid it could be Ben, who had just shot one of the wild animals and was looking for shelter. I grabbed on the metal door handle, took a deep breath, and as Ryan was still talking behind me, I opened the door. A cold chill ran down my spine. Standing there in front of me was Ryan. It didn't sink in at first, as he was saying, "Hey man, did you hear Ben's gun go off too? I think we need to find him and get the heck out of here." I babbled something incomprehensible and slowly turned around, pointing my flashlight all over the room. Nobody was there. When the light reached the corner of the room, I realized what I'd been looking at earlier. It was a pile of bones, and around them, forming a circle, was a bunch of skulls. Human skulls. We ran off as fast as we could and found Ben near the campsite. When he saw us, he began pale, as he didn't say a word. We got in my truck and drove the heck away from there, leaving that stuff behind. On the way back, after a long silence, I asked Ben what he'd shot at. Some things came up from behind the trees and attacked me, and I shot them. "Ben, what were those things?" "It was you guys. I killed you both back there." The rest of the way back, nobody spoke a word. We never saw Ben again.